psalm in just a few minutes, Psalm 14. Well, you may say, why do you stand down there sometime? Well, it's because when I stand this close to the 20-year-olds, I feel 20 years old. And then Rob showed up down here on the front row. Got me back in my element. I do like seeing these young folks up here. It thrills my soul. I want all of you to know that. And I know it's not just me, but it's others as well. So thank you for sitting up here. I appreciate the men who came this afternoon to our short, just a brief discussion and a reminder session really about our worship assemblies. I think it's good for us to keep in our minds the importance of these things, talk about those things, and I appreciate those who came. Appreciate the men who came yesterday to our Saturday in the Word study, and I think from all indication, I think we all benefited from that, those who came, and I appreciate those who came to that as well. Appreciate Rob's prayer tonight, remembering all these gentlemen. At least the ones specifically, I guess, that are mainly in our minds right now are men, because several of them had either had surgeries or recovering from surgeries or on the mend. I, too, think about Doug West a lot. Love Doug and Beth, and grateful that he has found out what he thinks is causing this, and we will all intently pray that he'll be back 100%. You know, I wouldn't want to get in Doug West's way if he was sick. I think he's the kind of guy, he's probably, if he's watching this right now, he's probably in that hospital bed in Birmingham trying to find a way out of there, if I had to guess. And Beth's probably standing at the door going, you can't leave yet. But we love Doug and Beth, and we're grateful that he's found out what the cause is, and hopefully he can be back with us very quickly. And all of them. Appreciate all of these. Bill James and Bill Reeves and Jerry, and Leldon's going to have his surgery. We want to keep him in our minds too. So let's just continue to remember all these people. Prayer is a great thing. We can pray to our Heavenly Father, and He'll hear us and He will help us. But He's encouraged, I think, by the prayers of righteous people. And it didn't say perfect people, it said righteous people. And we're made righteous because of what Jesus has done for us. And when we're grateful for that, I believe that the Lord will hear us. And I believe the Bible teaches that, and I know you do. So let's continue to think about all these who need God's help in special ways. Charles Dickens wrote a very well-known novel in 1859, whose beginning words are, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." He wrote that against the backdrop of the French Revolution, which took place in the late 18th century. And of course, in his mind, in the minds of those who lived through the French Revolution, like really any revolutionary period, when people are dealing with that, there is good and bad. That's the nature of the time. And I don't know that any phrase better describes our time than that. We live in the best of times, and we live in the worst of times. If I ask you tonight, what's something about the time in which we live that you love, you could give me a lot of answers. And if I also ask you, tell me some things about the time in which we live that you hate, you could give me a lot of answers. So really, it is the best of times, and it is the worst of times. I want to read a short, a brief part of an article that was written in 1987, before all of you, except you, were born. That was a good year. It's when Beth and I married. That was a good. She remembers that well, very fondly. 1987, 31 years ago. I want you to listen to it. It is not uncommon today to hear older Christians who have already reared their children comment somberly in the presence of young prospective parents. Quote, "I certainly wouldn't want to be bringing up children in times like these. It may be innocently done, but it is not helpful. These already anxious young people do not have a choice of times in which to rear children. For them, it is now or never. And candidly, from the short-term perspective, these are certainly not the best of times for the family. Much has happened in this century that serves to tear at the fabric of domestic life. We have become a city rather than a rural people, living in the anonymity of teeming urban anthills where no one knows or cares who his neighbors are. Our increasing mobility has made us a nation of strangers, and the once supportive influence of an extended family of grandparents, uncles, and aunts has been lost. Even the homemaker mother has been gradually disappearing before the increasing power of industrialization. Along with these important social and economic changes, there has been a significant philosophical shift. Our society has been increasingly secularized. Biblical values that once had at least some influence on our institutions have largely been set aside. From a world in which certain values were cherished, even though often violated, we have moved to one which denies that absolute values exist. Out of the passionate individualism which arose during the Vietnam War era has come a hedonistic pursuit of personal fulfillment, which is heedless of the consequences to others. Marriage and family commitments are seen as less important than the finding of one's self. Drug abuse and mindless sensuality abound. And to this already frightening equation must be added the insidious factor of television, which has the ability to instantly, universally, and powerfully infiltrate this moral and spiritual corruption into every American mind. There are phrases used in that short article that date it. Things like the insidious nature factor of television. Well, in 1987, there was not the insidious factor of the internet. The World Wide Web became publicly available about 1990 or 91. So when that article's written, cyberspace and things related to cyberspace, and there's a lot now to that, obviously, but that really wasn't a factor that most people, especially a preacher, an older preacher then, who wrote that article, would have known about. He talks about things like what happened in the post-Vietnam War era that people in 1987 would have still had on their minds in a lot of ways predominantly. But what he's saying is that it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. Now, all of us, if we wrote that article, if I wrote that article today and I was trying to make the same points, I would use some different specific things. But the fact of the matter is, these are hard times, and yet they're good times. And what I want to do tonight for just a minute is I want to encourage every parent who's in this audience tonight. I want to encourage you to not be discouraged. And I want to say it a little bit more positively. I want you to be strongly encouraged. Not just because of the responsibility you have, but I want you to be encouraged because of the success that you can have. And the good Lord knows that we need success when it comes to our children. Raising our children and creating opportunities for spiritual growth in our children, the Lord knows that about all of us. And I want to say this kind of as a side note too. I think really all of us, to some degree, are very proud of you. A lot of you are raising children, whether they're younger or older, but you're raising these children in less than ideal circumstances. Not only in your families, but you're raising them in less than ideal circumstances in terms of your nation and your culture. And yet I believe you're trying. You may be discouraged by that. And no doubt you probably are on occasion. We all are. There were times when, as we were raising our three, that we became discouraged, but it's not the time to quit. It's not the time to get down about it. It's really the time kind of to buckle up. And so to those of you who are trying to do that, I want to encourage you, understanding that circumstances that you're in are your circumstances. And you as a parent have responsibilities to try to raise your kids to the very best of your ability. And I want you to know tonight that I'm not going to be the one who's going around you going, I'm glad I'm not you. I tell you what, you weren't given the option of being born 40 years ago and raising your kids 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 80 years. You weren't given that option. You've been born now. You have families now. You're raising children now. Circumstances are like they are now. So now is the time for you to shine. And in case I forget it at the end, which I've got it in my notes to say, but I'm going to go ahead and say it now. I want to say this to the children. I don't care how young or how old you are. You need to understand how hard it can be for your parents to raise you. It's a difficult thing. It can be a frustrating thing. It can be a very rewarding thing. But as children who, I believe all of you are children who want to obey your parents, as Paul would say in Ephesians 6, you want to obey your parents in the Lord. You just continue to understand that by you obeying your parents and obeying them according to what God wants, that can be such a tremendous help to them. It's hard to even define that. It's hard to state that as well as I want to state it. But you need to understand as children, I don't care how old you are, if you're 2 and you hear me, you may not understand me, but you need to obey your parents. But if you're 22 or if you're 18 or 12 or wherever you are, you need to understand the value of helping your parents. Be good parents. And you have such a great role with that. And then maybe one last side before I move on. Be thankful. Be thankful that you have parents who care about you and want you to do well. Not everybody has that. That's a great, great blessing. Well, I want you to listen carefully in Psalm 14. This has to do with perspective. This has to do with kind of the perspective that I just read about. But this has to do with God's perspective, okay? The fool, verse 1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. They have all turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call on the Lord? There they are in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You shame the counsel of the poor, but the Lord in His refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion when the Lord brings back the captivity of His people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. I want you to envision the Lord, in essence, looking down on the earth, on the world, and asking Himself this question: is there not anybody who gets this? Is there not anybody who understands? And then thinking about what else He says by this. In verse 2, He says this, and I think it's good if we envision this. The Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men. I think it's significant that the psalmist says He looks down on the children of men. He's not looking at this from a purely spiritual standpoint, not right now. He's looking at this from a humanity standpoint. He looks down from heaven and he looks down upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. Now, think about God looking down from where He is in heaven. He's looking down upon mankind. And what do you think He sees in reference to how people view Him and in reference to how people pursue Him? I'll tell you how He sees that. How He sees that is, they have all turned aside. That's how He views it. They have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. Now, He's not saying there aren't any who do good, but He's saying from His perception of heaven, as He looks down, in essence what He sees is, there just aren't too many that are trying to follow me. I think that's what He's saying. That's His perspective. Verse 4, have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge? Who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call on the Lord. You see God looking at that and saying that about. And then verse 7 says, oh, that salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord brings back the captivity of His people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. There is a level of triumph that will take place in the future, I think is what the psalmist said. Psalm 14 verse 7 might be good for you parents to copy and frame, put it on I don't guess you'd frame it on your refrigerator. But put it somewhere where you can see it, because it's going to tell you that triumph can come. And triumph will come regardless of what circumstance you are involved with your family. But it's going to take some effort. Let me ask you this. What chances would you have given Amram and Jochebed, who were raising a daughter and a son, and then a third son, or a second son, but a third child? What percentage of this is going to work? Well, I want you to turn to Exodus 2. I want us to look I'm probably not going to read this, but I want to at least mention some things about the birth of Moses. And then I want to turn to Hebrews 11 and look at something with you in just a moment. The text doesn't tell us till Exodus 6 who Moses' parents really are. It tells us that a man of the house of Levi, verse 1, went, took his wife, a daughter of the Levites. The woman conceived and she bore a son. And when she saw, this would be Jochebed, when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. You remember as they're in Egypt, Pharaoh, we're not quite sure which Pharaoh this is, but Pharaoh is concerned that because the slave nation is increasing, he's going to have all the male babies born killed, because that will help slow down that population. And so Moses' mother hides him for 3 months. And the text tells us that when she could no longer hide him, she made what's called here really an ark of bulrushes, and she really daubed it with pitch so that it would be stay above water. And she put the child in it and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And then she asked Miriam, who would be Moses' sister. Moses obviously was the child, and Miriam, who was his sister, she had Miriam go down and watch that ark. Make sure that I know what's going on with my child. But he's got a better chance of surviving if somebody in Pharaoh's house finds him. They may have some feelings about that and not kill him, and that's exactly what happened. Pharaoh's daughter and her maidens who were along the river saw him and saw the baby and pick him up, and he's crying. They take him to Pharaoh's daughter, and Miriam sees that, and so she goes and she asks Pharaoh's daughter, would you like for me to find a Hebrew mother who can take care of this child for you? Pharaoh's daughter says, that'd be a great idea. So Miriam goes and gets her mother, Jochebed. It's all planned well, right? Can't you imagine the anxiousness of Jochebed as she awaits the news as to what's going to happen with her child? I know I don't have to tell you this. I'm not a mother. But I live with one. And I know how the one I live with loves her kids. I love them too, but I don't love them like their mother. That doesn't mean I don't love them. Don't let that get back to my kids. But a mother's love is different, and I understand that. And so I'm sure Jochebed is anxious about what's happening here, but obviously she takes care of the child in Pharaoh's house, takes care of it, and then ultimately Moses returns to Pharaoh's house apart from Jochebed, and he is raised there. Verse 10 says, the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Now, having read that story, I want you to turn over to Hebrews 11. And I want you to listen to some things that the Hebrew writer says about this, because I think this is important for us to think about too. Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child. Now, that word beautiful can mean what we commonly think it is. It may have been that he was a handsome baby. But very probably what it means more is he was beautiful to God. In other words, there was a sense in which they understood that he would be given to God. And so that made him beautiful. And the latter part of verse 23 says, and they, referring to his parents, they were not afraid of the king's command. They knew what the king wanted to do. That's why they had decided to do with Moses what they did. They weren't afraid of that. And so verse 24 continues, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And by faith they passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. That's really a summation, not of everything in Moses' life, but certainly of the events that happened fairly early in his life. But I think the thrust and the intensity of that passage is in the fact that Moses' parents made a wise choice. They thought that through. And I think what it produced, as we see in Moses, think about Moses. You know, we talk about Jacob and the level that he achieved in the Egyptian government. Well, Moses was in Pharaoh's house. And Moses was given, no doubt, every opportunity to achieve in terms of the Egyptians. He was given every opportunity to go as high as he could go. And yet, he reached a point where he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people in God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, which I know would have happened because of where he lived and whose daughter or whose son he was, at least in terms of the public perception. So you know what would have happened. But again, he chose some things that were good, and my guess is he chose many of those things because his mother had played a fairly instrumental part in his upbringing, even in a very difficult kind of way. She had to do it, I'm sure, in a very, very hard way. And I don't understand, but I can imagine Jochebed's having to give him up at certain points in that, and having to be very careful about what's being said, and just having to be careful in all that situation, but knowing this is that important. But she knew the importance of raising him to be the kind of person of faith that he became. And so I think that's an important lesson for all of us to understand. That would have been an easy place for her and for him to say, look at what all he can achieve. But what was most important is that he's a person of faith. I mean, and listen, he could have achieved a lot more than any of your kids could achieve. None of you are raising kids who have the ability, in essence, in this country to be in Pharaoh's house. You have blessings that you can give, but even you don't have that ability. They saw that wasn't the direction that they needed to go. And they did that, I think, amidst a very difficult culture and society, and really a familial situation that made it hard for them to do that. But yet, they did it. So fast forward to the first century. You know, the Roman Empire in the first century, probably half of the people who lived in the Roman Empire in those different provinces, probably half of those people were slaves, just like Egypt. They were slaves. And during the first century, there were things like easy divorce. Divorce was very common. Human life was cheap. Murder was frequent. Paganism was rampant. Immorality existed most everywhere. Sounds just like today, right? Best of times, worst of times. Good things, bad things. And yet somebody like a single mother, in essence, at least spiritually, Eunice, who raised her son Timothy to become someone that Paul would later call my own son in the faith, and a grandmother who was a part of a generation that evidently had obeyed the gospel according to Acts 14. And they were parents a mother and a grandmother who raised Timothy. So here's my point. Here's my point to all of you who are raising kids. Do not quit. You can do this. You've got the tools. You've got the support. You may not have the energy, but we'll help you. Energy is another issue. I can't help you much with the energy part of it. But you got people that want to help you, and I know you want to do well. And so I'm here not to say, sorry that you live where you live. I'm here to say I'm happy that you live when you live. This is your time. This is your time to say to your kids, listen, this is who we are. This is whose we are. And this is what we're going to do to the very best of your ability. Do your best and God is with you, and understand that you're not alone. And if in your minds your time has passed with your children, let me suggest this, that's not the case. You can still have influence. You can still be the kind of influence that God wants you to be. They have a mind of their own. I understand that. They'll have to make their own decisions, but you continue to be, as a mother and as a father, you continue to be the kind of influence that you need to be. And you need to understand that you're not alone. And God expects you, even in the environment that you live in. Even in these best of times and worst of times, God expects you and I, as parents, to be the kind of parents we need to be. So, that's it. There are a few things more important in life than leaving a legacy of a good parent. And remember what I said. A good parent, not a perfect parent. Not a parent whose kids are always perfect. There are no perfect kids. But a parent who understands where they are, and if we've made mistakes in the past, which all of us have made, I'm willing to say, I need to start and do better for where I'm at right now. I don't want to make the mistakes that I made, but I want to do better, and I'll do everything I can from this point on to try to be the best kind of parent that I can be, understanding that we all go through that. But my friends, if you're a parent, take some initiative. Take some initiative. Take the initiative to take advantage of every opportunity that God has given you to help your children. When the church provides opportunities for studies, do your best as a mother and a father to make sure your kids are there. Do your best. It may be a situation where you need to sit down with your children. They may not want to go. For whatever the reason. I'm not going to get into that because I don't know all that. But they may not want to go, but they need to go. And they need to have a conversation with you that's a discussion, but it's pretty much a one-sided discussion. They don't know as much as you know. They may at some point, but they don't now. They need you to help them decide what they need to do to help them be better spiritually. And there are a lot of nuances to all of those things, and I understand that. All of you have heard me preach many times before. When I first started preaching, my sermon was how to raise spiritually minded kids. And it changed to some things to think about when raising your kids. And it changed to good luck raising your kids. Kind of made that progression. But I know things are different with every single family. But as a mother and a father, you need to try to help your kids in every possible way. And that takes judgment. That takes being around the right influence. And let me go back to those of you who are children. Help your parents do that. Help them do that. Help them do that. And I'm going to say it again if you didn't hear it. Help them do that. Understand that they always want what's best for you. They want what's best for you spiritually. And it may be that you're at a time in your life where you don't always understand what that is, but they do. Help them with that. Make them good parents. You can help them if you will. And understand kind of where your parents come from. One day, it may be that you yourself, who are younger now, it may be that one day you become parents. I hope that God gives you that opportunity. And if He does, you'll look back on these times and there'll be things you wish you'd done differently. There'll be ways that you wished you had helped your parents instead of hindered your parents in your upbringing. So I want you to think carefully about that. I want mamas and daddies, and I want children to think about that carefully. So that's it. We're going to be led in an invitation song, and if you have a spiritual need tonight, let that be known by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.